So the topic today is global culture. Or maybe a better word would be global cultural diffusion or global cultural politics. Because the idea of global culture sometimes means there is a single overarching global culture or a global village. That's not what I'm talking about. Although that's an issue we need to address, whether there is a global culture or there is a possibility of a global civilization. But that could be posed as a question. But that's the answer is not yes, there is, because that's very problematic. Some people might think so if you're a very optimistic person, but really it's something that has to be interrogated, that question. But I think a good starting point for looking at global culture is Samuel Huntington's thesis of a class of civilization. So let me give you a little historical background. So the Cold War ended late 1980s, early 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, before that the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it creates a moment of kind of a euphoria, or at least hope, that the world is becoming more peaceful. Now, while the Cold War was ending, globalization was accelerating. So globalization has taken off in the 80s and 90s. And globalization, as we had discussed, is both in the economy but also in culture and politics. Politics in the sense of spread of certain values like democracy and human rights. But during the Cold War, it was the later stage of the Cold War, certainly economic globalization has taken off in terms of expansion of trade, expansion of investment, production networks, and the like. And at the same time, because of the role of multinational companies, we also had cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion here could mean movies or music, but also food, like McDonald's, for example, and Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I remember when my first visit to Beijing in 1992, I believe, and I remember being to the first McDonald's, just in the Tiananmen Square area. And it was really something, something like something new, something fantastic. People were like a tourist attraction. And so we had already that kind of diffusion happening towards the end of the Cold War. But the end of the Cold War itself created even more hope. So we have globalization, diffusion of consumer products, cultural products. A lot of them are American or Western. At the same time, we have hopes for peace, because the biggest sort of conflict since World War II had ended. So that creates the moment of overall sort of hope that the world is becoming not only peaceful but integrating. The idea of global village. There was a book called Jihad versus Macworld, and the idea that globalization is creating this kind of diffusion. The idea that the world is becoming flat. That was also the title of Tom Friedman's book, the New York Times columnist. You had a lot of talk like that. But then comes Samuel Huntington. And in an article first in Foreign Affairs and later on a book, just in the beginning of the 1990s, an article, and then in 96 followed with a book, he challenges the whole thing and says that actually culture is not unifying. Culture is dividing the world. And he used the term civilizations, or category, that far from becoming a peaceful place with a universal civilization emerging, we would see exactly the opposite class of civilizations. So to quote his Foreign Affairs article, the fundamental source of conflict in this new world will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict will be cultural. The principal conflicts of global politics will occur between nations and groups of different civilizations. So you can see that he is challenging the moment of hope for a global village and peace. Now, Huntington's thesis was in direct contradiction to also Francis Fukuyama's argument at that time, that which is called the end of history. The argument being that with the end of the Cold War, there is no alternative to liberal democracy and capitalism. And those have become the prevailing dominant ideologies and institutions of our time. There is no challenge, no alternative to them. But then Huntington is challenging all this. And the class of civilization thesis caught a lot of attention, and sometimes for reasons that people thought, yes, they saw the point in his argument. But sometimes also analysts and pundits thought this is a great idea to, keep up with our military preparedness. The threats have not ended. We are not going to go out of business. Now we have different types of threat, and we should keep investing in the military. And the military-industrial complex kind of likes this kind of argument because it keeps the threat going. Once the Soviet threat is gone, but there's a new threat, a different type of threat, which is a cultural class. So what kind of civilizations Huntington was talking about? So he identified the following civilizations in the world: Western, Confucian, which really is Chinese, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic, Orthodox. So Slavic Orthodox, one category, that is Russia and Eastern Europe, basically, Latin American, and possibly African. And his argument is these civilizations are going to clash with each other and create a new world disorder, so to speak. Why? Why do the civilizations clash? What was his argument? What are the underlying causes of this class of civilizations? So he gave a number of reasons. One is that there are differences among civilizations that are real and basic, like primordial. When we talk about basic identity of countries in terms of history, language, culture, tradition, religion, these are primordial. These go back in history. These are intrinsic to the identity of our societies. So very hard to give up, dilute, or make concessions in these areas. There are fundamentally different views on relations between God and man, individual and group, citizen and state, family relations, rights and responsibilities. Just to give you an example, that during the 1990s there was this talk about Asian values. The argument being, leaders like Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew would say that the prosperity of Asia has to do with Asian values, which is basically Confucian values, because East Asians work hard, save money, look after their family. The Westerners spend money and are more individualistic, and they're becoming less hardworking. So culture makes the difference between the West and the East Asian countries, the reason why East Asia is rising so fast. And an underlying argument there also is that East Asian culture is communitarian, whereas the Western culture is individualistic. So the Western countries put the individual before the society, or the self before the society. The East Asian countries put society before the self. So that's one argument of one example of what we are talking about, fundamental differences among civilizations in terms of culture, religions, identity, or views on relationship between individual and group. Now, I'm saying this to give you an example. I don't buy that. I am very critical of the Asian values concept. But that's one reason why civilizations clash. Another reason is globalization. We tend to think that globalization actually brings the world together. And globalization in terms of travel, migration, could bring the world together. But Huntington said it does the opposite, meaning it makes you more aware of how different you are from others. So if you are living in your own society, everybody seems alike, especially, let's say, Japan, which is a very homogeneous society in many ways. You don't feel self-conscious about your identity so much. But if you travel, go to, say, the Middle East or United States or Indonesia, you feel you are different. And they are different from you. So it makes you more conscious of your identity, of your civilization. And that can create conflict. That can create a loss of, a kind of a group consciousness, ethnic consciousness that can lead to conflict. The third argument of Huntington was that the nation state is weakening. The nation state is a political entity, and that can accommodate certain amount of diversity as long as every cultural group within a country can identify with states, the sovereign state, and the idea of the nation state. Nation state is a political concept, but civilization is a cultural concept. As people become more aware of the culture, they are less beholden to the nation state. So in a multi-ethnic society like Indonesia or India, where you have many different religions and ethnic groups coexisting, once they become more aware of the civilization, their loyalty to the state diminishes, at least of some of them, especially the minorities. This is nothing new, by the way. All these countries, many countries in the developing world, because of artificial nature of the colonial boundaries, or colonially imposed boundaries, they were already facing loss of identification between minority groups and the nation state, because the nation state was controlled by the dominant ethnic group. But Huntington's argument was that as civilizational identities increase because of travel, globalization, and the like, it sort of even further accentuates ethnic identities and therefore further loss of identification with the nation state. The political identity becomes less important than the civilizational identity, and it makes it difficult, therefore, to prevent conflict among different ethnic groups. Sometimes this is domestic, sometimes it spills over to international sphere. Then another point Huntington made was de-Westernization, what he called de-Westernization and indigenization. So his argument was that increasing Westernization, some people think of globalization as Westernization, basically spread of Western values, Western culture, Western products, and the like, including cultural products. As the Western dominance increases or has increased through both the previous 2 centuries, but continued to do so after the end of the Second World War, that is producing a backlash. And because the non-Western societies see themselves as kind of weaker, maybe some of them see themselves as inferior in terms of at least modernity, industrialization, and the like, they, instead of trying to emulate the West, they want to go back to the past. When you realize that you cannot catch up with Western modernity, Western economic and political institutions, and even if you try it, you are not going to be accepted as equal to the West. You want to go back to the non-Western roots. In some cases, those are glorious roots. Like this is an argument that can apply to the Middle East, but also to China, that but Middle East in particular, because Middle East, the Muslims had a glorious past. The Arab-led globalization, Arab knowledge, Arab philosophy, Arab science, all played a very important role in the medieval times, and until the rise of the West, between the rise of Islam and the rise of the West. But since then, the Arab world has fallen behind, and the Ottoman Empire was not an Arab empire, but it was an Islamic empire. And Ottoman Empire had its moment of glory. Mughal Empire had its moment of glory. But after the weakening of the Ottomans and the collapse of the Mughal Empire in the hands of the British, the glory of Islam has gone. And Islam has never really caught up with the West in terms of economics has not enjoyed the prestige that it once had. But when the civilizational identities kick in, civilization consciousness kicks in, there's a tendency to go back and find comfort in Islam's glorious past and revive, therefore, institutions and ideas and practices that existed during the period of Islam's heydays. And that creates what he call, what Huntington called de-Westernization and indigenization. And that accentuates the class of civilizations. Adding to that is another factor, and that has to do with the fact that cultural differences are more difficult to compromise and manage than political and economic ones. I mean, you can cooperate over economics or politics or security for practical reasons. So, for example, participating in the general agreements on tariffs and trade, international institutions like GATT, which became WTO, because you need to get the benefits of tariff reduction. So you can do joining institutions and engaging in cooperation has practical benefits. And therefore you can reconcile your differences, your interests, different interests to some extent. But that is very different from reconciling cultural and civilizational differences because they are more primordial, as I said earlier, but also, how do you do that? I mean, do you expect to convert to another religion, create a world religion, as some leaders in the past have tried to do? How do you bridge cultural differences that are ways of life with you? At least that was Huntington's argument. I personally don't see that being a big deal because nobody expects you to give up your religion or completely reconcile your identity with that of others. So I don't see it's a big deal. But it is true that sometimes, the general point is that oftentimes that cultural and religious differences are harder to reconcile than economic differences. Sometimes, but not necessarily. These differences are not irreconcilable. You can have coexistence. You can have mutual learning. As long as nobody is expecting to have a universal one religion, nobody is expecting you to convert to another religion. And the final factor behind the class of civilization that Huntington talks about is the rise of economic regionalism. That is something that was happening at that time. So economic regionalism was happening in Europe at that time with the creation of the European single market. And Huntington would argue that since Europe shares a common civilization, at least the European Union, so that is an example of civilizations mobilizing along regional lines. Okay. And you can find examples like that in ASEAN, although it would be pretty hard to think of ASEAN as a common civilization. But this was a time when a number of regional groups are coming up in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and also North American Free Trade Agreement. Maybe if you take Mexico out, US and Canada have a common civilization. You can think of Mexico as an heir to Western civilization because it was colonized by the Spaniards, but still it's hard to say it was a common civilization, but probably more common in civilizational affinities than, say, Southeast Asia or South Asia for that matter. But Huntington's point nonetheless was that economic regionalism is rising, and that is occurring within a common civilization, and that is also creating sources of conflict. So that was his argument, and one can have issues with each of these lines. I already mentioned a couple of points, but let's sort of put it on the table and say these are the explanations he provided as to why civilizations clash. What are the implications of this? Well, growing Islamic radicalism is one of them. In fact, I don't think it's unfair to say that the biggest impact of Huntington's class of civilization happened in the Western understanding of Islam. It was really a clash between two civilizations, the Western civilization and Islamic civilization. And so growing Islamic radicalism was one of the major implications or indicators in that sense of the class of civilizations thesis. Another one would be, this is again rather strange and controversial, but Huntington felt that there is going to be a Confucian Islamic nexus because of the shared desire to challenge the West. Now, Confucian Islamic means China and the Middle East. Nexus, linkage. The argument even was that China might provide weapons of mass destruction, like nuclear weapons, to Islamic radical states, like Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Let's put it on the table. I mean, it's really, in many ways, the least persuasive argument of Samuel Huntington, bordering on ridiculous. But there is a shared desire among the Islamic states and China to challenge the West, but going to the extent of China providing nuclear weapons to Arab states or Iran or generally to Muslim states seem a bit far-fetched. There is one exception to that. China did help Pakistan's nuclear program. There is plenty of evidence to support that today. But China supporting Iraq or providing nuclear technology to Iraq and the Middle East Arab countries like Saudi Arabia was a little far-fetched then and certainly now. Now, Huntington did argue that there will be no universal civilization, which is something one might really argue, that cultural differences will exist. But he emphasized that point, that there will be no universal civilization, but West versus the rest, and non-Western civilizations will become more wealthy and powerful and compete with the West to acquire weapons, wealth, technology, and skills without adopting Western values. They would be modern without being Western. So the key point was that non-Western countries are becoming modern without being Western. So modernity is not the same as Westernization. Now that's in some ways a fair point. That the fact that there will be no universal civilization is a fair point, in my view. But talking about an overarching West versus the rest divide probably is not. I think the idea that there will be multiple pathways to modernity and the countries in the non-Western world can become modern without Western, I think is a fair point. And that non-Western countries will become more wealthy and powerful is also a fair point, and that's happening. China, India, and Southeast Asian countries are increasingly, even African countries, to some extent, becoming more wealthy and powerful is happening. And the fact, it is true that they will acquire weapons, wealth, and technology. That is true. That is the global power shift. Huntington was not the first and was not the last to see that happening. But the implication of that being that it will lead to a class of civilizations, that this will create conflict because the non-West will challenge the West. That's something else. That's far more contentious. Of course, in one way, one can use this argument of Huntington to challenge the idea of a global liberal hegemony, a liberal hegemonic order, that everybody is adopting liberal values and being co-opted into the liberal order. So Huntington, I think, in my view, was right to challenge that. But taking it further and saying that there will be a class of civilization and that will be like the major threat to world order doesn't follow logically to me. And another point, another implication of Huntington's argument is that the West should develop more understanding of non-Western civilization and should increase its own solidarity and co-opt other similar civilizations like Latin America and Eastern Europe. So what he's saying in terms of implication is that the West should try to understand non-Western civilizations better. That's fair. Nobody can quarrel with that, whether you agree or disagree with class of civilizations. But going beyond that and saying West should increase its own solidarity or come together, create a kind of a alliance, and co-opt similar civilizations, which have greater similarity with the West than others, like Latin America, based on European heritage, or Eastern Europe, which was under communist rule during the Cold War, but now has become, after the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, has become again a region of independent states with affinity with the West. Religious affinity, Christianity, even though Eastern Europe is a Slavic Orthodox, a different type of civilization. According to Huntington, it's a different civilization. And Latin America is a different civilization. But the West could co-opt them, or try to co-opt them. In a sense, it contradicts Huntington's point of the class of civilization, because his categorization of civilizations is not really accepted by everybody. Say that Latin America and Eastern Europe are different civilizations from the West. And what is the West? Europe and the United States, Western Europe and the United States are the same civilization. All these are controversial. The boundaries, civilizational boundaries that Huntington drew are controversial. The fact that Japan is a different civilization from the Sinic civilization, China, is also contentious or debatable. But anyway, his idea that the West should co-opt Latin America and Eastern Europe and civilizations of Latin America and the Slavic Orthodox civilizations of Eastern Europe, in a sense, challenges his own thesis of class of civilizations. But it also proves that the main civilizational conflict we are talking about is between West and Islam. Because he could see kind of a nexus between China and Islam, so Confucian and Islamic civilization. He could see possibility of the Western civilization co-opting Latin American and Eastern Europe. So that basically leaves the relation between the West and China, so Western civilization and Chinese civilization, but Western civilization and Islamic civilization. And maybe you can add the Hindu civilization of India and the Islamic civilization. But at that time, and especially with the 9/11 attacks in almost like about a decade after Huntington's article was published, got everybody to focus on the West versus Islam versus the West aspect in the class of civilization. That is the crux of the class of civilizations thesis. So let's look at, I've already made some observations about where Huntington's thesis and argument reasoning is problematic. But I would like to add some more to that in terms of evidence. What is the evidence that civilizations were or are clashing? Well, I think one can find a lot of evidence that they are cooperating. Civilizations cooperate rather than clash. So look at the two members of the Islamic civilization, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. They were close allies of the West. Egypt since Camp David, Saudi Arabia right from the creation of Saudi Arabia. And Turkey, an Islamic country, majority country, is a member of NATO. And China, facing terrorism and extremism, is cooperating and has been cooperating with the West and the US against the terrorist challenge. So what it tells you that civilizations cooperate when there is a common interest. And one good example of that was the 9/11 attacks. When the 9/11 attacks happened, almost every country sided with the United States. And when the United States went to attack Taliban in Afghanistan, countries like Saudi Arabia and Gulf states supported the US. So Islamic countries supported the West, leader of the West, in fighting the Taliban, which was the biggest terrorist network of that time. So the practical evidence for Huntington was not really there in that time, in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. Another problem of evidence about Huntington's thesis, you already mentioned, that there was really no possibility or evidence of a Confucian Islamic nexus, or a kind of a nexus between, or a alliance between China and countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran. There was some talk about China supplying nuclear technology to Arabs, but really only Pakistan was the beneficiary of Chinese nuclear technology. And if you can say Pakistan was doing it on behalf of Saudi Arabia, well, some people say that's what Pakistan was trying to do, create not a Pakistani bomb, but an Islamic bomb. But China pulled back in supporting in terms of making its nuclear technology available to Islamic states. Now, there is some controversy about when China stopped it, to what extent China was supporting Pakistan. But generally, yes, there is enough evidence to say China was doing that to Pakistan. But to the rest of the Islamic world, I think that's really not borne out by evidence. And also, that doesn't create a nexus in terms of an alliance between China and Islam. To cast it as a civilizational alliance is very problematic. Regionalism, another indicator or a point of evidence Huntington provided to justify his class of civilizations thesis, was not emerging along civilizational lines. Only the Western European Union is along civilizational lines. ASEAN is a total refutation of Huntington's thesis. ASEAN members are from so many different religions and ethnic backgrounds. So it's hard to say that ASEAN reflects the coming together of countries within a civilization. So ASEAN members include Islamic countries, Islamic majority countries, or Muslim majority countries, like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei. Buddhist countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar. Catholic Christian countries, majority countries like Philippines, and Confucian countries like Singapore. Vietnam and all joined later. But the original members of ASEAN represented Islam, Buddhism, and Confucianism, and Christianity. So how can you say that regionalism is developing along civilizational lines? That will be really a gross mischaracterization of regionalism. And we have all kinds of evidence of different types of regional arrangements. If you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership later, what happened later, the United States comes in with Singapore and Malaysia and Japan, happens across civilizational lines. The ASEAN Regional Forum, regional organization, really is an inter-regional organization. Has European Union, China, Russia, India, United States. Have I left any civilizations out? All civilizations are represented there. So, this is a very weak argument. Regionalism is really not a expression of civilizational identity in the way Huntington puts it. There is, of course, some similarity, cultural similarity, some geographic proximity does imply at some point that there would be some sharing of culture, language, through interactions. But many regional organizations, or most of them, are very diverse. There is no European Union-like organization in most parts of the world. Latin America may be a little different because Latin America all have a shared sort of heritage from Spain, Portugal, or Europe. But in Africa, Middle East, Arab League, one might talk about that. Arab League has a shared civilizational identity, but Arab League is the weakest of regional organizations. Actually, that's very, very interesting point. One of the strongest evidence of why Huntington was wrong, that Arab League is the most homogeneous regional organization in the world, because everybody is Muslim and everybody is Arab. But Arab League is the weakest regional organization in the world. If civilizations mattered, Arab League will be the strongest regional organization. ASEAN is the most diverse regional organization, civilizationally speaking. But ASEAN is the most successful regional organization of the developing world. Now, Huntington was talking about economics rather than broadly regionalism as such. But still, I mean, ASEAN has an ASEAN Economic Community. So it is an economic organization as well as political or security framework or cooperation framework. Arab League did not have much economics in it. There had been talk about economic cooperation in the Arab League. But the Gulf Cooperation Council is not only Arab Muslim, but also in the same Arabian Persian Gulf area. And it doesn't really have a strong economic role. It's all there is similarity. All of the countries are producing natural resources and the like, but they never really, advanced in terms of economic integration. Latin America, culturally, civilizationally, may be homogeneous, but very weak regional economic cooperation. So I don't see any correlation between economic regionalism and civilizational affinity. You can have good economic cooperation without civilizational affinity, and you can have zero or very minimal economic cooperation despite civilizational affinity. So to use economic regionalism as an indicator of class of civilization is plain wrong. Then this idea of that different civilizational identities are primordial, and therefore it's very hard to get a consensus or agreement among civilizations on things like relations between state and society, which then boils down to the question of human rights and democracy. It is true that West has more democracy and other civilizations have less democracy. But there are plenty of democracies in the non-Western world. So when Indonesia became democratic after Suharto, well, here is the largest Muslim majority democracy in the world. So that means the differences over democratization between the West and the non-Western civilization is not fundamental. And it is true that Huntington said it is easier to forge economic and political agreement than agreement over religion and identity, religion and culture. But they are not delinked. Culture and religion and political institutions are also linked. So if Indonesians were culturally and civilizationally that different from Western civilization, and since democracy and human rights are so closely associated with the Western civilization, how come the largest Muslim majority country in the world accepted human rights and democracy, and successfully? Indonesia is become a thriving democracy after the fall of Suharto. So that basically means that it is possible for a concept like human rights, ideas and institutions of human rights and democracy can taking root in different civilizational contexts. Even though the very idea of human rights and democracy speaks to state-society relations, different ideas about state-society relations between ruler and ruled, which according to Huntington are primordial to be reconciled between civilizations. But you can see that these ideas taking root across civilizations. Democracy could be found across civilizations. In India, Indonesia, the India being Hindu civilization, Indonesia Muslim civilization, Japan, Japanese civilization, Taiwan, Confucian civilization. Taiwan is often seen as the first successful Confucian democracy. Now, I'm not getting into whether Taiwan is part of China and others, but Taiwan proves that it is possible to have democracy, a successful democracy within a Confucian civilization or within the Sinic civilization. And this has been a matter of a lot of intellectual debate that since Taiwan can be a democracy, why can't be mainland China? There is nothing intrinsic about China or mainland China being communist or authoritarian. That it is quite possible to visualize a period where China could become more democratic. It's not like a Western liberal democracy. In fact, a lot of Chinese scholars look at that, and they say that there are models of Chinese democracy, and Taiwan being one of them, and Brazil and Latin America. Latin America has gone through a lot of ups and downs, but majority of Latin American countries have become democratic. So again, Huntington would say Latin America is very similar to the Western civilization, but then similar, but it's not the same. So the fact that you can find evidence of you can find democratic political systems in every civilization tells you that democracy is not the monopoly of a civilization, and democracy is not in any way linked with a class of civilizations. The class of civilizations is reflected in domestic political systems. That means some civilizations choose democracy over others. There are other criticisms one can make about this. So some of them have been made by my article in the Monkey Cage blog in Washington Post. The primary source of conflict today is still over economic and strategic issues, sovereignty, territory, trade, rather than culture. If you look at North and South Korea, China, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine. Ukraine is actually both Slavic and Orthodox. Western and Orthodox. But Russia and Ukraine are both, Ukraine has two parts. So the Eastern Ukraine is more Slavic Orthodox. The Western Ukraine is more like Western Europe. But we have, therefore, conflict. We still have conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And it is not because of, despite the civilizational affinity, Ukraine doesn't want to be part of Russia. And that's why we had the crisis in Ukraine leading to the annexation of Crimea by Russia. But you look at the conflict between North and South Korea. Same civilization in conflict. China and Taiwan, same civilization in conflict. So the real issue of conflict is not civilization. It's actually territory, sovereignty, and economics. I mean, economics in some ways, trade wars and the like, which is coming visible today. Also, another point of criticism of Huntington would be that there is more of a class within a civilization than class between civilizations. So a lot of conflicts and deaths today happen in the Islamic world as sectarian conflicts. So Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the terrorist groups, they are challenging as much Islamic regimes as much as Western ones. And then Al-Qaeda wanted to topple the Saudi regime, for example. The Sunni Shia classes in Pakistan and other places have claimed lots of lives. The conflict in Syria, the conflict in Lebanon, all these tell you that a conflict in Iraq. These are classes within civilizations. In fact, if you look at the terrorism data, a lot more people die of terrorist attacks, a lot more Muslims die of terrorist attacks than other people of other culture. The biggest victims of terrorism are Muslims themselves. So you have to keep that in mind when you talk about the class of civilizations thesis. Civilizations learn from each other. That's the next point. And we have talked about it through history, how civilizations learn from each other. Greeks learning from Sumerians and Egyptians, Arabs learning from Greek, the Western civilization at Renaissance learning from the Arabs, and China getting religion from, say, India, Japan learning from China, Japan being a provider of knowledge and technology to Asia after World War II. This diffusion of civilizational ideas and innovations is a constant throughout history. What's true of the classical world is true of today. So that is another powerful challenge to class of civilization thesis, and that being that civilizations make class, but they also learn from each other. In fact, intercivilizational diffusion is it's a constant of history. There is probably as much evidence, or more, if not more, to support mutual learning and diffusion of ideas and innovations across civilizations as conflict or war between civilizations. A final point of criticism of Huntington's thesis would be that it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and actually in a sense has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That the idea of a class of civilization did create fear and influence policy, which then created additional sources of regions for conflict. So when Huntington published this article in the book, the United States and the West were in search of a kind of new enemy in some ways. The Soviet Union has collapsed. So what's the rationale for having NATO? What is the rationale for having large military? Well, the Huntington provided the rationale. So we have Islam, we have China, we have even Russia, the NATO, which many people thought, at least some analysts said so, that NATO has lost its rationale. NATO should not be expanded. George F. Kennan, who was the father of containment, said NATO expansion to Eastern Europe will be a big mistake, historic mistake. But the strategic elites in the United States kept talking about, thinking about the Russian threat. At a time when Russia was weak and willing to make a long-term deal under Boris Yeltsin after Gorbachev, before Putin. But at least that's the way some analysts think, that the United States did not take up the chance. It wanted Russia, or the strategic elite of the United States, the NATO supporters wanted to keep NATO, and they saw Russia as a long-term threat, and Russia did become a long-term threat. And from that point of view, had there been a genuine effort at reconciliation with Russia, maybe even Russian membership for NATO, we may have a very different Europe today. And similarly with the case of Islam, when everything that happens, every conflict that happens in the world, somehow the class of civilization comes in. So Ukraine was a class of civilization, Iraq was a class of civilization, Afghanistan was a class of civilization, Libya was a class of civilization, China-US rivalry is a class of civilization. So class of civilizations becomes kind of a legitimizing idea behind a lot of policies, which continues to bolster the military-industrial complex in the West. And that has a global chain reaction, which means that thesis has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, I want to stop here and take a break, and I'll come back and finish it up with a further discussion of the convergence hypothesis, which is the opposite of the class of civilization hypothesis. Are cultures converging if they're not classing? And then we look at that and then draw some implications for world order more generally. So after looking at the class of civilization thesis, let's now spend some time talking about the other side of the picture, cultural convergence. Is there the world is moving in the opposite direction, which again, as I said in the beginning, there are some people who do believe in convergence, and that was actually kind of the hope in the late Cold War period and just after the Cold War ended, because of globalization, acceleration of globalization, creating diffusion of food and culture, music, cultural products like films, and also the hope that capitalism and democracy will be the only alternatives left to the world. There will be no alternative to those ideas or institutions. And that hope was there, and then Huntington, of course, challenges that, and then people criticize Huntington's critiques, said that he is misrepresenting the reality. So in response to Huntington, there was a movement to create dialogues of civilization, and with the hope that a civilizational class can be averted. But let's look at what kind of convergence or cultural diffusion, I would call it diffusion rather than convergence, is happening. Certainly a lot of that is happening. And if I look at two examples, internet and social media and then film, some of this comes through. The evidence for cultural diffusion or interaction, and the spread of communication and transport is happening, creating the possible basis of a cultural convergence. So internet is internet and social media is one of the first places to start. So in 2018, January 2018, there are more than 4 billion people in the world using the internet. That's more than half of the world's population online. 2/3 of the world's 7.6 billion inhabitants now have a mobile phone. So that's very high. Mobile phone makes it easy to not only access internet, but also communicate directly with people. More than 3 billion people use social media each month, with 9 of the 10 of those people accessing their chosen platforms via mobile devices. This information is from a website, wearesocial.com. So, if you look at the usage of internet in 2018, you can see some. I can give you some data on this, but this data is available everywhere. The total population of the world, again, more than half are internet users. Close to half are social media users. And about a third are active mobile social media users, meaning they access the internet, social media through the mobile devices. Facebook is the top social media platform, followed by YouTube, WhatsApp, and Instagram and Twitter are actually within the top 10 in some ways in this list. Facebook is, of course, the height the top choice of the social media is called the social network. So that is creating a communication system in the world that has the potential to bring the world together and create cultural convergence. Films are another, but a little more complex example of this cultural diffusion. Films are doing very well. The global box office revenue is forecast to increase from US $38 billion in 2016 to US $50 billion in 2020, according to one projection. But there are also some interesting changes happening in the world of film. The United States is now the third largest film market in the world. Before it was number 2. India, or Bollywood, was number 1. Bollywood was number 1 in terms of production. In terms of ticket sale, United States was actually the largest source of revenue. But now China and India have overtaken. They are the largest film market in the world in terms of tickets sold per year. In terms of production of movies, Hollywood used to be number 2, now it's number 3. It's been it was always overtaken by Bollywood. India was for a long time and remains the largest producer of movies in the world. But Nigeria, what is called Nollywood, has surpassed Hollywood as the world's second largest movie industry by volume in terms of number of movies produced, behind India's Bollywood. Another interesting change is that the domestic U.S. box office accounted for only in the 1980s, the biggest revenues from movies were generated in the U.S. So 80% of the revenue of films were generated at the U.S. box office. Now, this is the reverse. Foreign receipts or foreign revenues of movies are much greater than those of the revenues that are generated in the U.S. So, while in the 1980s, U.S. box office accounted for 80% of revenue of films, now foreign receipts generate over 70% of the revenues. Now, this is interesting because it has some real implications. Because it means that foreign markets are more important. foreign markets are more important for U.S. movies. So U.S. movies make more money abroad than in the U.S. What does it mean? Like China is now the biggest market for U.S. movies. What does it mean? That means U.S. producers have to cater to the consumers' tastes elsewhere. So I've read that no big movie is being produced in Hollywood these days without looking at how it might sell in the Chinese market. And in that sense, it's also giving space to more independent producers rather than the big producers who basically used to produce for the American market. There's more opportunity for non-mainstream material and more opportunity for independent movie producers. So, according to one statistics, the number of movies released by the big 6 studios in the US between 2002 and 2011 dropped by 43%, while those releases by independent producers jumped by 74%. So there is a lesser dominance of big 6 studios, more chance for independent producers. Locally made films, this is another trend, rather than Hollywood, still popular with the local audiences, especially in large markets such as India. Now, when you talk about the movie industry, people think everybody watches Hollywood and the Hollywood films dominate, and they do. But that's not, one has to keep that in perspective. If you are Indian, you are more likely to see an Indian movie rather than a Hollywood movie. Because Indian Bollywood produces so many movies, and Hollywood movies are expensive, at least used to be. When I grew up as a child, I did not watch a Hollywood film, English film, until I was 21 or so. So my first, second, third, all the movies I saw in my teens were actually locally Bollywood movies plus some vernacular movies, because India has a vernacular industry, Bengali, Oriya, Tamil, and the like. Now that's very important because the local audience matters and local productions matter. Now, I don't know what is the situation in China, but I see Chinese probably see a lot more Hollywood films as they grow up than, say, Indians do. But still, increasingly, Chinese also watch movies in Hong Kong, produced in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has a very thriving movie industry. But whether Chinese producers, their own movies will dominate the China market is a very important question. I sense that there is a growth of China's domestic movie industry, and they produce some real classics, and those films are going to be more and more popular in China rather than the Hollywood movies imported. Even as Hollywood tries to adapt to the Chinese market by catering to the taste of Chinese consumers. There are other cultural products which are making waves. Korean drama is hugely popular. Korean drama and pop, which is called Hallyu, is really popular throughout Asia now, throughout the world. Japanese manga comics, not a movie industry, but comics are very popular throughout the world. Hong Kong movies and Taiwanese singers are also very popular. But particularly look at the movie industry, you do get a pattern that while the American dominance remains, there is a global shift in box office power. Just like we talk about the global shift in power, there's a global shift in box office power, which means the emerging powers like China and India are increasingly more influential. Not in terms of producing the most blockbusters, although they do, and the film Bahubali is a blockbuster in India, which is also popular in East Asia and outside. Chinese audiences loved several Indian films in the recent years. Even President Xi Jinping said he has watched this particular Indian film about the boxing fan.
That's the wrestling athletes and father and his daughters.
He very probably he watched it several times, and So what I'm saying is that Indian films have always been popular in Southeast Asia. In countries like Malaysia, there's an argument, even in China, that movies produced in India are more realistic to them because they are more Asian rather than the Hollywood more fantasies. So cultural test does play a role, even though Hollywood movies remain dominant and popular, but there is also space for products, cultural products, which are more in tune with local taste and local cultural preferences. So where does this all lead to world order? Now, I'm only giving you 2 examples of internet, social media, and films. We can talk about also, food like diffusion and impact of Western food. Italian pizza or McDonald's are very, very important. Kentucky Fried Chicken, Coke. Now, they all remain important, but increasingly you see that the larger emerging countries are making their own impact in this global cultural market. So what does that mean for world order? Now, class of civilizations, one visualization of the impact of culture on world order, which talks about conflict among civilizations. On the other side is this idea of a global imaginary, the idea of the global village. But I think one doesn't have to buy either. I think globalization of culture and cultural diversity or local cultural diversity can go hand in hand. So Huntington or his opposite, the thesis of Huntington or his opposite, the convergence of civilization, may both be wrong. We could have a situation where because Huntington is basing his argument on cultural diversity. Now, I don't think anybody can deny that, cultural diversity. But does cultural diversity needs to conflict? That is the key question. And I think that's where Huntington comes short, that he assumes that somehow cultural diversity leads to conflict. But that conflict, or any potential for conflict in cultural diversity, could be mitigated if you have cultural diffusion and cultural understanding. But at the same time, that understanding need not be to the extreme that we create a global village and everybody becomes basically similar. So I'm talking about a middle ground between the class of civilizations thesis and the convergence of civilizations thesis, a class of cultures and convergence of cultures. I think that would be a world where diversity remains but doesn't necessarily become a source of conflict, but actually can become a source of understanding. As long as, if people like each other's movies, people like each other's songs, it creates more understanding rather than creates conflict. Another point here is the phenomenon of localization. You will find that almost in every case through history, ideas are never adopted, but they are adapted. That the consumers of ideas, the recipients of ideas, often localize foreign ideas, foreign culture, cultural products to suit their own taste, to own beliefs, their own prior cultural beliefs and habits. And that happens in art, that happens in food, that happens in cultural products. I mean, classic example would be McDonald's. When it goes to India, McDonald's cannot sell hamburgers. It can sell lamb burgers because Hindu Indians, majority of Indians don't eat beef. Foreign companies always look at localizing the product to cater to local consumers. Same thing with ideas. Same thing when Chinese population adopted Buddhism, Chinese rulers and society adopted Buddhism from, say, India, they did not keep it as is. There were Chinese characteristics. They localized the Buddhist theology, Buddhist imagery, Buddhist art to reflect or to inject Chinese elements. So The images of Buddha, for example, becomes localized and sinicized. So if you go to the Chinese grottos like Yungang Grotto in Shanxi province, which was probably one of the first Chinese Buddhist cave sculptures in China, you'll find that it was built by the Northern Wei dynasty, and within a span of half a decade, the images, which originally looked like a Mongol, and the Mongol big and huge, and also had Indian features, gradually, but within a matter of several decades, adopted Chinese features. The images of Buddha became less Indian and more Chinese. And you'll find that Buddhism diffusion in Japan, when Japanese got Buddhism, they also localized the imagery. So localization, where the recipients of ideas redefine, adapt, sometimes selectively, the features of a foreign idea or a foreign imagery or a foreign product to suit local need, local taste, local culture. That's called localization. And that's universally true through the ages. But it also means that that's one of the ways in which culture can spread without creating disruption. That foreign culture cannot threaten local culture, but find a common ground because of the tendency towards localization. And localization can be done by the local agents, the consumers or recipients. It can also be done by the providers. The multinational companies today consciously localize their products in different markets. Like as I said, give the example of McDonald's, but you can find that in almost every consumer product. And another little related point is that while we see a lot of globalization happening in economics, food, travel, tourism, all these things are expanding, but it's happening less at the cultural level, in the sense that there is more resistance to adopt foreign culture than, say, travel abroad. And in some ways, travel makes you more conscious of your own identity and than your own cultural background. So that, to that extent, globalization is making you aware of your identity. It's a kind of an argument Huntington makes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that being conscious of our own identity means you are going to fight with other cultures. And or you are going to adapt for them. You're not going to fight other cultures, neither are going to completely adapt to other cultures. There is always an element of resistance, somewhere in between. People are not going to adapt other cultures simply because they travel. At the same time, they're not going to fight other, or have feelings of antagonism towards other cultures because of travel. Somewhere, the reality is gray. It's somewhere in between, that you can enjoy travel or benefits of globalization and tourism and the like without giving up your own culture, without creating cultural, without being part of a cultural homogenization process. Okay. So I therefore conclude that neither Huntington nor the cultural convergence thesis is in between. Is right. The reality is somewhere in between. I think it's plausible to argue that cultural diversity is not going to disappear. But one other thing that needs to be brought into the picture here is the implications for cultural diffusion for U.S. power or Western dominance in the world. I think Western cultural dominance is declining in many areas, in film and in food, and in popular culture as well. But it's not disappearing. But one thing that it does is that things like communication technology could make other countries more aware of the limitations of Western culture or Western ideas and institutions. So an example of that is that when you have more news about what's happening in American domestic politics, American elections, the decay of urban areas in the United States, you sort of lose your sort of fantasy about the United States being a model country, attractive country. The United States is attractive, but not as attractive as you would have otherwise thought based on what you have imagined or what you have read or sometimes selectively seen. So the American soft power, which is based on your attractiveness, and cultural attractiveness is one of them, or social attractiveness is the attractiveness of a political social system is one of them. That attractiveness can diminish as you become more aware, thanks to globalization and communications, media, social media, and other media, of the limitations of the U.S. system. So in that sense, it kind of parallels the decline of the West, because people are more aware of what's wrong with the West rather than what is right with the West. There are a lot of things that are right about the West, but there are also a lot of things wrong about the West, and that becomes more visible with expansion of communication and social media. So during the last 2016 presidential election in the U.S., a lot of people lost their admiration for the United States political system, because if you can get somebody like Trump elected, and the media coverage is now easily available, everybody can see this for themselves, they don't have to be interpreted to them, they would become less attractive to the U.S. Similarly, if something good happens they would be United States attractiveness will increase. But the United States, to the extent that people claim that, scholars like Joseph Nye say, United States tops in the world in soft power. So it can only go down from there. And that happens because people are more aware of the limitations of the West, the problems of the West, and they get that through media, social media, communication, travel, and the like. What all this leads to is, again, this idea of mutual learning, or what I call uploading. Now, some scholars like the historian Niall Ferguson, for example, he's a pundit rather than just a scholar. He argues that the rest of the world, including countries like China, progressed by imitating the West, by downloading Western innovation ideas and institutions. And that's an argument that goes into the cultural idea of global cultural diffusion. The global cultural diffusion kind of has been a one-way street, so coming from the West to the rest. But one could argue that more and more it was actually always a two-way street. Maybe not so much in the last 200 years when the West was really dominant, but as I say, in the past, the Islamic, Chinese, Indian civilizations provided a lot of ideas and innovations to the West. Then came the period of Western dominance. But now we may be getting back to the stage where diffusion of culture and ideas will be a two-way process. So the rest of the world is not simply downloading ideas and innovations from the West. It's also uploading. It's providing ideas, innovations that the West can imitate. It might be reflected in culture. Culture will be a good place where it will be reflected, but also in even scientific and technical innovations and applications of technology. So the world is therefore becoming more complex. Diffusion of ideas and culture is a two-way street, not a one-way street. There is more diversity rather than homogenization. The idea that there is a liberal order or there is a dominant Western civilization that is has a universal appeal is really becoming less plausible. What is more plausible is that the world is becoming more complex and diverse, and diversity is not going to disappear. But diversity need not lead to a class of civilization. Because same cultural diffusion, localization, and resistance to foreign culture that or indigenization, as Samuel Huntington put it, that may create tendencies towards conflict, could also help to mitigate conflict, because cultural diffusion can create understanding, a two-way understanding, not a dominant Western model or cultural model imposing itself on the rest. So this is what I call a multiplex world. Giving you a metaphor of films, that if you go to a multiplex, you don't have a choice of one movie. You have choice of several movies. And especially if you are living in, not in the United States, but you're living in a place like Singapore, for example. Singapore has 3 national languages, Malay, Hindi, Tamil, and English, and 4, Chinese. So you can get a choice of seeing an English Hollywood film, a Chinese film, maybe made in Hong Kong or mainland China, Tamil film, and Malaysia doesn't produce too many movies, but there are such movies. So multiplex gives the audience greater choice. As you move away from dominant producers to, like the traditional big house movie producers, to independent producers. As big movie producers in Hollywood cater to local taste, because that's how the market is. They make more of their profit for outside the United States than in the US. You'll find that diversity will increase without necessarily creating a class of civilizations. But that's what I call a multiplex world, where you have multiple actors, producers, plots, and directors, the audience have a choice of different films rather than the one single film, whether it's America or West or liberal. You will find that the world order is no longer either a Western order or a Chinese order or an Indian order, but a multiplex order. Diversity will remain a fact of life, but it doesn't need to lead to a class of civilizations because of a cultural diffusion. The same cultural argument that Huntington uses to present his class of civilization thesis can be also used, and if you understand it as cultural diffusion, to say, to make a case that class of civilization can be avoided, understanding created, without necessarily leading to a global village. So that is basically what the idea of global culture is about. The idea of global culture is not a single overarching universal culture affecting or including and shaping the lives of all people everywhere. Global culture means having diversity in the world in cultural, civilizational, as well as political and ideational and economic systems, while at the same time trying to find common ground. Because culture, like economics or institutions, the idea of global culture, just like global economy or global governance, provides an avenue for interaction and understanding. And the idea of global culture, therefore, is not a single dominant culture or a universal culture, but living with what is called multiple modernities, multiple ideas, multiple identities, but finding common ground because of cultural diffusion, which is not dominated by a single source, or it's not a one-way street, but a two-way street. So that is my idea of a multiplex world, which challenges the idea of class of civilization, of Huntington, or the other extreme of that, the convergence of civilizations, or the global village imagery.